Hi everyone, my name's Marcellus. I'm wrapping up our sermon series on the book of Ezra. And for the really observant amongst you, you'll realise that we haven't even finished the book of Ezra. In fact, we're just about halfway through. And what's more, Ezra himself hasn't even entered into the book. The reason we're doing that is because God has spoke to us through prophetic voices in the church and said during this time that we can't meet together, we should be building altars to him, which are times and places that we're with God. So what we've done is we've focused on the first part of the book of Ezra, and that's the story of the first people who leave exile in Babylon and go back to Jerusalem to build an altar. And these guys are led by Zerubbabel and inspired by the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah. And we've come to chapter 6, and they've built the altar. They've built it despite distraction, despite disappointment, opposition and difficulty. They've actually built the altar. And so now in chapter 6, we get to see finally what they do with this altar. So we're going to start in verse 19. And it says this: On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbours, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. And the first thing that I want to say is that an altar is a place of joy. It's a place of joy. That's what you see in the Bible. That's what you see from the God of Moses, Abraham and Isaac. When we set up altars to him, it is a place of joy. It's a place where men and women come to God in worship and obedience and delight. That's the point. That's the point of the altar. That's been the point of the last 6 chapters, going through all this difficulty, going through all of these distractions. It's not so they can just tough it out. It's been so that they can enjoy God, so they can enjoy the King of Heaven. The second half of chapter 6 is basically all about joy and enjoying. In 9 verses, there are 2 festivals. One of which is celebrated with joy, and the other one is celebrated for 7 days with joy, which I guess is kind of like, you've been joyful once, now let's see if we can add an endurance component to it. And that's what they've been building to. And so when God says to us, I want you to build an altar in your lives, I think sometimes we can think, oh gosh, just got to nail it down, just got to get out there, just got to do it. And I think some of it, there is an element of that, but it's because we need a place in the middle of our lives where the joy of the Lord runs into us and runs out into the rest of our lives, into our families around us, into our friends, into our work colleagues. That's the reason we're up early in the morning with the Bible open. We're up singing and worshipping him, praying in tongues. It's not to be hard, it's not to tough it out, to just keep getting better, but it's because he's the Father, he's our Father and he loves us. He's the Father of lights, James says, from whom every good and perfect gift comes. And so when we set up an altar, it's a place where we enjoy and get joy from God. But we've got to be careful of what we focus on. Because sometimes, instead of focusing on what God is doing, so in this moment, we could fail to focus on what God is saying, and instead we could say, well, we're not meeting together on a Sunday. We're not doing it as the way we would want to do it. Instead of focusing on what God is doing, we can focus on what he isn't doing. And the guys in Ezra 6, man, could they have done that. I don't know if you remember, but earlier on, when they first lay the foundation for the temple, when it should be this great excitement, people start crying because the temple's nowhere near what they expected. People could have sat back in Ezra 6 and said, oh, it's all a bit small, the sacrifice is a bit sad, our nation is still just a colony. So they had a choice, because frankly, if you look at the way Solomon dedicates the temple, the first temple, my goodness, the feasts and the sacrifices, they go on for days. They sacrifice herds of animals. And then you look at what Zerubbabel and his guy do, and it's these 12 quite pitiful goats. And actually, we can, if we're not careful, we can focus on God, on what God isn't doing, rather than what God is doing and what He has called us to. He has called us to build altars. And when we focus on what God's not doing, I think we miss our role. Church, we don't get to do what we're made to do. And what we are made to do is barbecue at our altars. Bear with me. The Apostle Peter tells us that when we become Christians, we become a nation of priests. And have a look at what the priests are doing. So it says on the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who returned from exile ate it, together with all who have separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbours, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. What are the priests doing? They're barbecuing at the altar. I remember Luke and Sammy's wedding years ago now. They had a reception on their top field, and it's this stunning location. You can see for miles, and towards the end of the reception, their caterers lit a barbecue. And so you kind of got the sun going down, and you've got the fire, the light from the fire beginning to flicker across the sky, and the wood smoke's beginning to curl up into the evening. And basically, people begin to smell the smoke, and they begin to gather like no one's left in the marquee. And then the guy gets the slabs of meat out, he sort of holds them in his hand, and then they hit the barbecue and they begin to sizzle up, and the smell just floats across the evening. And all of a sudden, everyone's there, and all the kids are there, and all the grown-ups are there, and everyone's standing around. They're enjoying being together. There's banter, and they're taking bits of the meat, and they're eating a little bit of the meat. You're trying to get a bit off the barbecue before the guy can hit you with his prongs. And that is what the altar looks like in action. That's what an altar looks like in action. It's a place of joy and celebration. It's not those things at the front of church. We need to get them out of our mind. It's a wedding. It's a festival with fire and meat and eating and celebrating. And the priests are there, and we're the priests, and they're inviting everyone in. Do you see that? They're inviting everyone in. God has been inviting us to set up altars so that we can enjoy Him and then invite everyone else in. We should be like guys with singed eyebrows and slightly toasted hands because we've been handling the meat. We should be guys, men and women, who've kindled the fire of our own altars early in the morning. We've known what it is to get before God, get our Bible out before God at the kitchen table, in a few moments in the afternoon in the office, or in the evening over dinner, or before bed, and then because we've tasted and we've enjoyed, to hand out the meat, to hand out the spoils. It says to the exiles, to the church, to their relatives, to your family, for yourselves, and for everyone who seeks God. You see, we've got a role here. A role of enjoying God in the secret place, enjoying Him at the altar, and then handing that out, inviting the world to come and see, to come and taste that He is good. And what I so love about this, moment is it's beautiful because it's multi-layered and it shouts Jesus' name. So the festival that they're celebrating in Ezra is the Passover festival. And that's the festival to remember when God saved them from slavery in Egypt. And this is way back towards the beginning of the Bible in Exodus. And God rescues them from the hand of a great oppressor, just like he's done in Ezra. And God does it by getting them to sacrifice a lamb on an altar, taking the blood from the lamb and wiping it, smearing it across the doorframe so that God's judgment would pass over. So that's what Ezra's doing in this festival. They're copying this moment. They're sacrificing the Passover lambs for each of the 12 tribes. So the lamb is taking their sin and God is passing over it. And then they eat the lamb, they enjoy the lamb in celebration. And so you've got this moment in the book of Ezra, which is sort of in the middle of the Bible, and then we go to the back of the Bible, we go into the Gospel of John, and then there's this other beautiful moment, and hundreds of years later, John the Baptist sees Jesus walking towards him, and he says, "Look, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world." And we know he's not saying he's a lamb. We know exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about the Passover festival. He's saying Jesus is the Passover lamb. He's the sacrifice and the blood that will end all sacrifices and all blood and cause God's judgment to pass over all who seek the Lord. And it's all going on in Ezra. And so then later in the Gospel of John, when Jesus says, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him on the last day." When he says that in the Gospel of John, we know he's not talking about cannibalism. Instead, this picture is again an illustration of the Passover lamb who is sacrificed, that we get to enjoy, that we get to delight in, that we get to eat, that we get to savour, that he becomes our sustenance, he becomes our life. We enter into all the benefits of Jesus' sacrifice. So for joy, we are purifying ourselves. We're building altars, we're lighting fires, we're coming before God at our barbecue altars of joy. And we're doing it for ourselves, we're doing it for the church, we're doing it for our relatives, for everyone around us. And we have this amazing privilege. We're meant to be priests, come from the altar, who smell of wood smoke, who've got fat running down our hands and meat in our hands, giving it to the world who needs Jesus, taking Jesus to the world around us.